Welcome to Resiliency The Podcast. Today's guest is an economist whose work lives at the intersection of climate change, innovation, and human resilience. He's a globally respected thought leader in sustainable growth, clean investment, and the economics of climate action. He's a partner at Independent Economics, which is an international economic advisory working with senior global advisors to help businesses and governments address increasingly complex issues, where he co-heads macroeconomics and financial markets, as well as innovation and sustainability work. Now, he's also the special advisor for the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at Cambridge. He's a visiting senior fellow at the London School of Economics. He has served as head of economic forecasting at HM Treasury and led the Stern Review on the economics of climate change. So it's not just all of these credits and all of this work that sets today's guest apart. What really sets him apart is his perspective. Today's guest understands that the climate conversation is not just about carbon or capital. It's about trust, inclusion, and the systems that can either hold us back or help us move forward. Please welcome an amazing global leader, Mr. Dimitri Zengelis. Welcome, Dimitri.
Wow, what an introduction. Thanks, Jen. It's great to be here.
Oh, Dimitri, we are so excited that you're here, and thank you so much for saying yes. And let me wish you Happy New Year, and I'm so happy to see your
Happy New
face
Year.
again.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. Here we go, 2026. Fasten our seatbelts.
That's right.
Woohoo.
Fasten our seatbelts. So that leads me to the very first question. Fasten our seatbelts. What does resiliency mean to you?
Right. Well, I mean, I think resilience to me means the ability to withstand shocks, withstand surprises, and rebuild and bounce back. And it's not always easy to do that. And, preparation and forethought and a little bit of investment, whether it's time or money or emotional capital, can strengthen a person's or a society's ability to be resilient in the face of surprises. And one thing that we shouldn't be about is that we will get surprises. So we need to plan for them. One doesn't want to go down the road of Donald Rumsfeld, but there are known unknowns out there, and we need to plan for them.
I love what you've said because you're talking about shocks and surprises, and I think this year is a year already of shocks and surprises.
Right.
We continue to, I'd say, globally and geopolitically and in all ways, have all of these shocks and surprises. And you specifically work in economics and in climate change, and those are some massive places where we have seen a lot of that change. As you said, change is now a constant. So, and also you're working across all these organizations, which we talked about in the intro. How do you personally, Dimitri, stay grounded and resilient as you look at and solve all these big, complex problems of the world?
Well, I mean, I think it's probably a stretch to say that we've solved them, but it is at least heartening to know that a lot of us are working on them. And, I think to some extent, empowerment and a bit of control, dare I say it, can help, alleviate anxiety. So in that sense, the fact that I feel I can do something about this makes me at least more encouraged and especially when I can see routes to resolving some of these issues. I mean, that has a flip side, of course, because often you find that these routes are so self-evidently beneficial that it's pretty galling to figure out why we're not doing it, and why we haven't been doing it already. Why is this such a struggle? But it gives you insights to the way society works in that process. And I think, one of the reasons, and we'll probably come back to this, but one of the reasons why so often we struggle to make progress on issues such as a lot of the shocks in terms of resilience, not just climate, but pandemics and technological shocks and so on, is that people don't feel that they have the power to make a difference. And therefore they feel a little bit resigned, and they feel, by being disempowered, they feel that actually the whole thing is just too big, and it's better to just not think about it. So you get a kind of cognitive dissonance, or worse still, you get a reaction, you get a backlash. Who are all these people on their high horses telling me what to do? Well, given that I can't do anything about it, and there are elites and others who have put us in this situation, I don't want to be hectored. I don't want to be lectured. I don't want to be given a sort of moral talking to. So the whole kind of inclusion part of this, which I'm sure we will come back to, is really important. But, coming back to my own experience, I do feel included. I see this as a big issue, and I'm lucky enough to be working with a lot of great people in trying to find a resolution, and then trying to communicate that and build a narrative and encourage others to do so in a way that's in their self-interest rather than in, the self-interest of, even future generations or people far, far away. This is in everybody's interest, and so everybody should play their part.
I'd like to stay just for a minute. You've said maybe we'll come back to the concept of inclusion. I'd like to stay in this space
Sure.
just for a few
Mm.
minutes because, there's a lot of people and organizations that are helping others deal with things like climate anxiety.
Mm.
The inability to, there's another COP whatever number we're on. And I can't affect any change, so why should I care? Why would I bother? What's the interest in it for me? And I'd like to ask you, how do we help people feel more included in climate solutions, especially those who are skeptical or those who feel left out, so that it's a shared goal rather than we're seeing like this political fight right now,
That's right.
geopolitically, we're certainly seeing it. How do we fix that?
Right. So, I mean, an obvious answer is you want to make this inclusive, right? So you want the opportunities to apply to as many people as possible. And, people rightly respond. If your job depends on the fossil fuel industry, if you're a coal miner or you're in a community that's based on oil, this change is gonna be a painful one, right? If you're living in somewhere that's not well connected, that can't access public transport, you can't afford the latest electric vehicles. You've got an old clunker of a car because that's what you have and it's cheap. You can't afford to rip out a boiler and replace it with a heat pump. Having all these kind of much wealthier and well-off people tell you that this is something that you must do can come across a bit obnoxious, quite frankly, and will often sort of box people into corners where they say, well, you haven't done much for me. Why should I now join into what looks like your kind of moral crusade that you can spend money on and I can't? So I think that's a sort of practical answer. You want to make sure that people are retooled, they're reskilled. If there are opportunities in this new economy, and I would argue that they are, and that they outweigh the opportunities from the old economy, then everybody should be enabled to have access to it. And, in some cases, it might even just mean compensation. But obviously, if you don't spell out what those opportunities are and you don't talk about self-interest, you're very unlikely to get much traction. The other problem we have that you've touched upon is that, unfortunately, politics has taken a nasty turn. And we can talk about whether that's a reaction to some extent to growing inequality and lack of inclusion, and the divide between educated elites and others. And I think there's a lot to introspect there. But politics has become way more tribal now. It's become a bit of a team sport. It almost doesn't matter what the issues are. You pick your team, and you get a bunch of you get like a sort of a basket or a shopping list of issues that come with that team. And there's no necessity. You might take a strong stance on immigration, on abortion. That doesn't mean that by necessity you should deny the importance of climate risks or climate action. They are very separate issues, but unfortunately they tend to be bunched together so that people that take a position on one have a sort of almost tribal association with a bunch of other positions, which actually ought to be irrelevant. So I think a lot of the work we need to undertake is to try and undo that. So people can think for themselves what's an issue that best serves their interests rather than the interests of the tribe or the interests of the team. Because I think this tribal thinking ultimately is not going to serve anyone except for the political elites and their friends and their funders. And I don't think if you ask people genuinely what they want, that is actually what they're aiming to do. They need to start thinking for themselves, but they need to have the ammunition and they need to have the information and they need to have the narratives in order to really kind of powerfully make those cases rather than have other people preach those stories to them.
Boy, you have nailed it. I mean, wow, on exactly what's happening in American
Sure.
politics, because
Yeah.
in a true way, something comes up, and the feeling I get from those that you would talk to are like, well, what am I supposed to believe about this? based
Right.
upon what side I'm on. And that is something that is being orchestrated through communications, through the way that's happening, is that people are being pushed to kind of choose sides. And interesting, I never would have connected this to inclusion, but it's exactly is. It's inclusion, which is this idea of making it understood what is the benefit to the person. In marketing, we call it the WIFM, WIIFM, what's in it for me.
Yeah.
So it's helping people understand that WIFM. And
Yeah.
so now there's lots of challenges with the climate. We all know that. We're all afraid. And you mentioned that people might look at it as a moral crusade, that you are, you're taking your own morals to go do this. But there are actually a ton of benefits, as you're saying, to me today, not just a future generation, but to me in facilitating and supporting and becoming part of this climate change. Some of the things that I have from the notes that you shared are things like cheaper energy, smarter systems, greater efficiency. So I want to know from you, Dimitri, in your role working across the globe in all of this, if anything, is there anything giving you hope that this transition is underway, that this is taking place?
Well, what's giving me hope that the transition is underway is the fact that the transition is underway. It may not feel like that, particularly in the US right now, but the pace at which the world has shifted to renewables and is now shifting to electrification and electric vehicles and so on has far outstripped anybody's expectations. And the reason for that is that it's now become self-evident that these are far more economically cost-effective forms of energy and economic systems. They weren't always, and they required taxpayers' money to make it so. But now, the world has been investing more in renewables than in fossil fuel electricity, and actually, in recent years, in everything, including transport. But for a decade, the world's been investing more in renewable electricity than in electricity that is sourced from gas and coal predominantly. And that's worth bearing in mind. I'm not talking about Scandinavia or California, or I'm talking about the world, the whole world. Now, people will say, yeah, but, 3/4 of our electricity is still generated through fossil fuels. But that's because the legacy capital is still there. The flows of investments are now all in renewables because they're, almost all in renewables. It's about 90 something percent currently. And they're into renewables because they're just much cheaper. They outcompete fossil fuels economically, especially over the lifetime of the capital. But actually, in many cases, it's actually cheaper to just scrap perfectly working gas and coal-fired power stations and switch to renewables because it's still cheaper. And so that's what the world has predominantly been doing. Nobody anticipated that. To the extent that there's another 5 or 10% that still invest in fossil fuels for their electricity, that's often for political reason. The coal lobby is a powerful lobby. The oil and gas lobby, they're powerful lobbies. And it's also because in some parts of the world, including bits of China, which has really pushed renewable energy to great commercial advantage, the grids just haven't been upgraded to a sufficient standard to cope with some of the intermittency. But those are all solvable, and they are being solved. So what gives me hope, to answer your question, is that this transition is now unstoppable. Actually, that ship has sailed. We will be generating our electricity towards the middle and end of this century worldwide, including in the US, through renewables and battery storage. We will all be driving electric vehicles. The question that Americans need to think about, and Europeans too, is will those vehicles be produced at home because we've taken a strategic position to push those sectors, or will we be importing them from China and elsewhere? And for a long time, speaking as a European, the European car industry has said, look, it's too soon to invest in battery electric vehicles. The technology is unproven. It's expensive. It's too soon. It's too soon. And then one morning they wake up and they say it's too late. The Chinese have stolen our lunch, and we can't compete with them anymore. So let's try and get as many concessions to kind of allow us to squeeze that last bit out of the combustion engine for as long as we possibly can. And it's a similar story in America. But that's not in Europe's self-interest. It's not in America's self-interest. If I was somebody who was hell-bent on reducing America's power in the world, and handing over economic advantage to the Chinese, I would be seriously pushing America to keep investing in fossil fuels, to sell a narrative of burn, baby, burn, and to miss out on the revolution that the rest of the world is going to profit from. Extraordinarily, there are some parties within your own system that are actually championing those very antics. I would go as far as say that's unpatriotic, because you really are shooting the American economy in the foot. Like I said already, we're all going to be driving electric vehicles. We're all going to be generating our energy from renewables. Why? Because it's much cheaper. And one last, important, footnote to this. As Sam Altman and others have testified, the cost of AI, which is predominantly the cost of compute and data storage, is going to converge on the cost of electricity. Who's going to have the cheapest electricity? I can tell you with a great deal of certainty that's going to be China. Why? Well, because they've been spending all these years investing in renewables and battery storage, and that is per unit cost and operating cost. That's where energy costs are going to fall. The economy of the 19th and 20th century and the 18th century, indeed, especially in this country, were powered by fossil fuels. That's not going to be the source of energy that's going to power the economy in the 21st century.
I really want to jump in. I know Dr. Kelly has a question for you, but I'm so glad you brought up AI, because I work in an industry that focuses on commercial real estate investment. There's a ton of discussion around data centers and their development and how much energy they really suck. And so I can look at that from the infrastructure standpoint and say, I see your point, which is to say, well, we're going to have to figure out how to borrow or get energy from countries that have been doing it better than us, earlier than us. Do you see anything happening as far as demand? So here's what I understand. I've read an article that said something like, when you are polite to AI, like to Chat GPT, it costs like $4 million or something. Like just to say thank you, because processing that takes so much. Is there going to be some sort of education that helps people understand you should only use AI during these times? How do we temper this demand that is going exponential while we have these power crises?
The short answer is we need to invest substantially in the grid. And, around the world, we're doing that. China's doing that at an extraordinary rate. We're doing that at a rate, actually, that is far higher than people commonly recognize. We're only a fraction of a percentage point shy of what the International Energy Agency tells us we need to do in terms of growth in the electricity grid in order to meet a net zero target for 2050. And by the way, that's not trivial. We're going to have enough, grid. We're going to have enough electricity cables, more or less, to get us to the sun and halfway back by, some estimates. That's a lot of cables. That can be done. There are technologies in new cables that can transmit a lot more power using far fewer materials. This stuff can then be recycled and so on. A lot of the talk about AI and water use is a little bit exaggerated, because this is water that doesn't have to come from municipal sources. Water isn't as rare as we make out, but purified drinking water is. So there are ways that we can resolve some of these problems. But it's true, AI does mean in the short run we have to ramp up our energy, and some of that will be done through dispatchable gas. Most of that, even now, is going to be done through renewables. And there's, you are seeing most of the technology companies rapidly kind of filling every square inch of their rooftops, car parks, and other properties with solar panels, because that's the fastest and cheapest way to do it. But I think ultimately the benefits from AI in terms of optimizing systems, in terms of innovation, in terms of real-time monitoring and management, not just of energy, but of food and of industrial supply lines, affords us so much opportunity to cut costs and to improve the efficiency of the economic system, that actually the benefits are worth it. And ultimately, that extra electricity will be powered through renewables and storage. What it does mean, however, is that in the short run, there's going to be quite a crunch, as there's a race to get hold of those minerals. There will be a bit of a crunch to get these pieces of capital equipment, which require silicon, which require lithium, which require copper, depending on the technology. And that's going to have to be done in a hurry, because we're going to put these sources of energy and systemic transition systems up. And once they're up, they stay up. And that's a key difference from fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, you've got to burn them, you've got to dig them out, you've got to pump them out, you've got to put them in pipelines and ships, on trains, transport them halfway across the world, refine them, distribute them, burn them, whether it's in a combustion engine or an electricity generating plant. And then when you've done that, you've got to go back and do it all over again. Which, by the way, is why fossil fuels are uncompetitive, because they have one element, one part of that production process, which is incredibly expensive, and that's labor. You need an awful lot of labor to do all the digging and transporting and refining and then do it again. Once you put up a solar panel or a wind farm, it more or less takes care of itself. Sure, there's a bit of maintenance, right? But there isn't this huge army of people working and supplying the raw materials. That's why, that's because it's renewable. And that's why the costs are coming down, because the costs are a function of technologies, of production processes, learning by doing in factories and distribution and maintenance and so on. Whereas the costs of fossil fuel are a function of how many people you need to employ and how exotic the technique and remote the location from which you need to get the fossil fuel from. And obviously, the more fossil fuel you want, the higher those costs. So that's why the race is being won by these new sectors.
I think you've just brilliantly described what I'm going to call the great transition. There's points in time in history where there's been a huge transition, and this is one of them. And I'd like to ask you, how do we make climate transition easier, particularly for people who lack the means to change how they live, work, or travel? You talked about somebody still has an old clunker of a car and they don't have, they don't have public transit. I'm in Ontario right now on the family farm. There's no transit here. If you don't have a vehicle,
Yeah.
life isn't going to work. And so we can't be so sanctimonious. That's my word. You used a different one on how we take these values and say, okay, now everybody has to do that. But what do we do? How do we do that, Dimitri?
Yeah, sanctimonious, I think, is a fair term. I mean, the answer is that we need to kind of share the opportunities and share the costs. The reality is that that's difficult. The politics is difficult, and a lot of people who ultimately will benefit from cheaper bills, cheaper electricity, and the jobs that come with it in the short run will be worst affected. And everyone knows the cost in the short run. You know what it means to change your boiler or buy a new car. Somebody telling you that if you don't support this change, your job's going to go somewhere in China. Yeah, well, okay, but that sounds a bit more like an opinion, and it's unproven. And by the time you find out it's true, it's too late anyway. But the cost of the car, here and now. So I think some of this is going to just be intractable. There's always difficulty in structural change in this country. When people shifted from candles to kerosene and then to electricity, the whalers went on strike. They did that because they wanted to postpone electrification. It wouldn't have made a difference in the long run. We were always going to electrify, just as, drill, baby, drill is not going to make a difference in the long run. The US will be generating its power like everybody else through renewables and electricity and driving electric vehicles. But in that transition, I think you need to think very carefully about the distributional impacts, the inclusion, the opportunities. You're not going to solve all of them. You're not going to be able to compensate everyone. But I think a lot of people, if they realize or recognize that this is the way the world is going to go, and realize and recognize that actually there are a lot of opportunities that can be made by actually proactively planning and managing that transition, they might, from a perspective of self-interest and resilience, say, look, I can't adopt the ostrich mentality and dig my head in the sand, because that's not going to help me and it's not going to help my family. I need to kind of recognize which way the proverbial bread is buttered, and start doing my best to play a part of that. So I want to make my organization best in class in terms of efficiency, for example, or in terms of its ability to export to global markets that may be carbon constrained or might have tougher policies than we do at the moment. These are all things that reflect an understanding of the way the world is going. And I think more and more as people come to recognize, because even the oil companies recognize that demand for oil is going to start to wane. We've probably reached peak fossil fuel this year. China's probably reached peak fossil fuel this year. The US actually reached peak fossil fuel way back in the 1980s, Europe in the 1970s. So we've all been weaning ourselves off fossil fuel. It's been India and China that have been driving the demand. China and India, they're both about, in fact, India has already peaked and China's about to peak. There's not much left, right? So the fossil fuel companies, they know that. That's why they don't want to talk up renewables, because if you do that, then you talk down the oil price, because the oil price today is a function of demand for oil in the future. You can store oil, it's fungible. So you don't want to tell anybody that there's not going to be as much demand for oil in the future. If you're a half competent oil executive, you've got to tell a very different story. It would be an abrogation of your duties if you started championing renewables. You'd be eating into your own profits, and you should probably be sacked if you do it. So the fact that people point to oil companies as a source of genuine and reliable expectations as to the energy transition always strikes me as somewhat staggering. But individuals who understand the story, they can behave in a very different manner. And again, it's back to resilience. If you understand the likely direction of change and what nature that change may take, you can put you and your family, and indeed the organization you work for, in a better, more future-proof position to withstand those kinds of transitionary shocks.
I just need to comment and say it's a bit of a wow for me, because I hear people who are climate experts, but it's rare that I run into someone like you, Dimitri, who is both a climate expert and an economic expert. It's kind of like I feel like I'm at a bar and somebody threw two darts and they both hit the bullseye at the same time, because your understanding is so interesting, especially talking about how again, we're back into what's in it for me, what's in it for the economist or for the politician or for the person who's leading someone. You can't say, well, we're going to be tearing down oil, because it affects what's on that balance sheet. It affects the futures, the pro forma, whatever that is, that's what exists. So it's really a perfect transition.
I'm so sorry.
Oh, please. No, don't be sorry.
It's one of the reasons why China has been so proactive, right? They don't have much oil. They import a lot of it. So they figured out, look, we don't have much oil. We can see that electricity and electric vehicles and renewables are going to be cheaper. We're not going to compete with the Germans on the combustion engine because they're light years ahead of us. Why don't we invest in electric vehicles and wipe the floor? And boy, are they wiping the floor. They did it for all sorts of reasons. They invested in renewables partly because they understood the commercial reality, partly because they're China and they can make long-term decisions without having to, be quite so constrained by, the piffling nuisance of democracy. So the fact that people might have opposed it didn't necessarily get in the way of the 13th, 14th five-year plans. And they did it partly, and this is almost the opposite of, this is an example of the opposite of what I've just said, because despite the lack of kind of formalized democratic processes, the Chinese government doesn't like being unpopular amongst influential urban middle classes, who in China were choking, often to death, not even as a hyperbole, but as a fact, through particulate pollution. Where does particulate pollution come from? It comes from coal-fired generation. Where does nitrogen pollution come from? It comes from cars. So they had a short-term, narrow reason to push the renewable agenda and the electric vehicle agenda, because it would clean up their cities, and that was a very popular thing to do. So the Chinese have acted brilliantly. They've solved a local problem. They've cornered a market. It's now too late, really, for the rest of the world to compete with China on batteries, on electric vehicles, and on renewables, because these sectors have economies of scale. So the more you invest in them, the cheaper they become. The cheaper they become, the more people, the more you build these knowledge clusters and supply lines in those parts of the world that dominate the production of these things. So it's a bit hard for the rest of the world to get a look in. But it's been a mix of politics. It's been a mix of self-interest. And it's been a mix of strategic planning that has worked very well for China. I don't think it's beyond the scope of Western democracies to do more, to think strategically, despite the constraints associated with having to bring people along with you, and the fact that these people will understand the costs of change better than they will understand the benefits. That's normal. Change is always asymmetric in terms of how people perceive the impact. The losers of any change, they know exactly who they are. They know how much it's going to cost. They know, in the case of corporations, which politicians' ears to bend in order to stop the change from happening. The beneficiaries from change, they're often a bit further out. They're more diffuse. They're all of us as consumers who will get better products, cheaper energy, more innovation. And they are often companies and businesses that have yet to scale up and become profitable and create jobs. So, change is a difficult thing to bring about, but, in a very dynamic way, the US, for example, has been very good at generating change through entrepreneurial spirit, through the scale of the market, through finance. But the politics has also been very helpful. There's been huge amounts of investment, public investment in DARPA, in the Institute of Health, and in other organizations that has pushed the knowledge frontier, not to mention NASA and the defense industry, but has had spillovers into other sectors. So, again, from the US perspective, a move that goes completely the opposite direction to what China's doing, which is to invest less in science and research and development and less in the technologies of tomorrow, could really cost American households, American families dear in an environment where the world is changing so rapidly. And I worry about that. Why is there a sort of death wish going on in parts of the world that's handing on a plate such huge economic advantage to our key competitor, which is China? It's kind of balmy.
I totally agree with what Dimitri's just said. Like make this make sense. It's hard to make this make sense. And I think it comes back to, the thing, if we take a resilience lens on this, resilience requires long-term planning, like what China is able to do. Resilience is not politically expedient,
Yeah.
ever.
No, that's right.
And, and we can, that's it. That's the bottom line. So we need to always take that long-term view and then work back on how do we want to get there. And that's not an easy thing for governments to want to be able to do. I think of China, I think of Singapore. I can't think of anybody else, to tell you the truth. So it's a hard thing to do. And politics has become so polarized.
Yeah.
And we talk about populism coming up about, this is a tough nut to crack.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's a bit, we can, you can think of a sort of personal analogy. If you want to be resilient, you need to consider what you eat, and you might want to visit the gym. That's not easy in the short run, right? It's painful in the short run. We'd all rather sit on the couch and watch TV if we had a choice, and eat, great bags of comfort food, and ice cream and God knows what. But resilience requires doing something different and thinking ahead. And that's never going to be that easy. If it was that easy, we'd all do it and we'd be resilient, right? So, in terms of the countries that you listed, I mean, I think there are perhaps a few others, and there are examples from the US, from different states in the US of strategic planning from cities in the US. There are examples in Europe, perhaps especially in Scandinavia. There's a shining example in Asia, which is South Korea. South Korea took a number of economic strategic decisions to transition its economy. Began with heavy industries, shipbuilding, chemicals, then went on to consumer electronics, and then it went on to high-end technologies. And we now have Samsung phones giving Apple a run for its money. South Korea did not begin by having comparative advantages in any of these sectors. It was policy-led strategic decisions that allowed it to do so well out of this. If South Korea adopted some of the recommendations of the World Bank and the IMF and others by pursuing its comparative advantage in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, then the South Korean economy would probably be the world's most efficient and successful exporter of rice by now. Thankfully, they didn't do that. They took strategic decisions to build entirely new production sectors and have done very well out of it. They now have a per capita income that's higher than most of Europe and higher than many states in the US.
It's incredible to me because on a global scale, I mean, there's there's tug and pull everywhere, and everything that you're talking about shows me that, and I'll restate what you said, which is it's a race to the top, right? The governments are racing forward. I want to bring this to the corporate lens. You mentioned this earlier about corporate leaders and how they can take part. And actually, it's interesting. I liked your metaphor about if we all want to lose weight, we'd go to the gym and we'd eat right, you know. And my question, I'm going to frame it through
I'm
the
not saying I
corporate lens, which
practice
is,
all that, but
hey, look, it's the new year. We're all practicing it for a day.
yeah,
But
This
quite,
week.
quite,
but it's a little harder. It's when we are kind of self-governed. I'm sitting on my couch. I can decide if I want to eat ice cream or if I want to go and do that. But when you come into, and I'm going to look just through the corporate lens and not the government lens. On the corporate lens, there's a governance. You know, that you have stakeholders, you have shareholders, you have a board of directors, and there is a massive focus on profit, profit, profit. And a lot of your message, Dimitri, it focuses on human capital and social capital, and really kind of making all boats rise by making good long-term decisions.
yeah.
So I guess I want to know from you, what's it going to take for leaders at the corporate level to start seeing that this type of resilience is not a cost, but it's actually an opportunity. It's a competitive advantage. It's a shared prosperity opportunity.
Right. That is exactly the question. And look, we need to start by recognizing, we've said already that change can be painful. We've said already that there are distributional consequences. And look, let's be realistic. There's money still to be squeezed out of fossil fuels, right? And it's cheap money. It's easy money because you don't have to make much of an effort to transition anything. You just keep sweating the assets you got. The reality, of course, is that if you want to stay in business in the, in the 2030s and the 2040s, and you really want to have networks and systems that are cost effective and are compatible with the technologies and indeed the institutions and social choices of future decades, you need to think about investing in assets that are future proofed. And that means not only your buildings and your infrastructure. We talked about electricity grids. We talked about networking ICT and bringing AI into control systems and optimize systems across the world. But you also need your human capital to match up. You need the skills of your workers to be able to roll out those new technologies, to find a way where AI makes whatever existing workforces do more efficient and productive, rather than being replaced by either other countries or indeed AI itself. However this pans out, this revolution is going to be disruptive. A lot of jobs will change. That doesn't mean that people are going to be forced out of the labor market entirely, or at least the ones that that at least reckon for this change are much more likely to be the last people standing. And I think in any case, they'll create whole new sectors and whole new industries that integrate AI in a commercially profitable way that employs other people in those industries. But they need to be the ones that think ahead. So future-proofing skills, future-proofing physical assets, but also intangible assets, the technologies, the ideas, the processes, and indeed the institutions that are necessary to allow and enable this kind of change. And that includes political institutions, it includes social capital, the issues we talked about in terms of trust, in terms of people seeing this as being in their collective interest and actually rallying around a government that says, look, why don't we make this as profitable as possible before somebody else does? And see this as a way to enable our own national aspirations to be met. That requires leadership. We talked about strategic decisions. Strategic decisions don't happen in a vacuum. They require leadership. Innovation doesn't happen in a vacuum. It often requires leadership. It requires somebody to say, look, there's money to be made in committing money now into something that isn't yet profitable because we think it will be profitable. None of that is about looking backwards. None of that is about squeezing the most out of the economy we had in the past. It's about looking forward. It's about resilience, and it's about future-proofing the assets that you invest in. And we're all faced with investment decisions, whether we're households or businesses. And if we see those investments through that lens, then I think we're much more likely to make the right choices and much less likely to be left with stranded assets, stranded infrastructure, and stranded skills, which are either going to be devalued or scrapped in the economy of the future.
Wow. Okay. I'm dying to ask a question. And this is one I'm just interested in it because when
Yeah.
you talk about future proofing, and I love what you talked about future proof your assets, your skills, everything. And you also talked at some point during this about long term versus short term decisions and how we have to look at the long term impact. And my question, which is again, it's a weird one. When I think of a corporation, I think of people who have a leader who spends their lifetime sitting in that seat. When I think of politics, I think of someone who spins in and out every 4 years or 8 years. And sometimes, as we've seen, the person who's sitting in the seat has very different thoughts that, or maybe they're worried about their whiffum, their what's in it for
Yeah, yeah,
me.
yeah.
I kind of want to ask about that dichotomy between government and corporate, and how do you build long-term thinking in whenever it's a revolving door?
Oh, and it's critical because the two interact and reinforce each other. Look, if you're going to buy an electric vehicle, you want to feel that there's a public program to encourage recharging, right? You feel that's not going to happen for another 5 or 10 years. You'll hold back buying an electric vehicle. If you hold back buying an electric vehicle, then your electric vehicle industry is not going to flourish, and in a sense, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Those that oppose the change, show that it wasn't ever that successful. So the psychology of change is really critically important. If you're a mayor or a business person or a politician and you tell people that, renewables and electric vehicles are prohibitively expensive, and there's no new market for them and the finance is niche, are they going to invest in this stuff? It's very unlikely. Well, it's actually the investment and the rolling out of all this kit that brings the cost down. So if they don't invest in it, the cost won't come down, and the whole thing becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If, on the other hand, you say, look, this is the future, the costs are going to come down, the market's enormous, there's great profit potential, and the finance is becoming mainstream, then they end up investing and they bring the cost down, and that also becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, obviously the engineering and the technology has to work, otherwise it's just one big Ponzi scheme. But the Chinese have shown us very clearly that it does work, and there are others across the world that are showing us that it does work. So this interaction between policy and business through leadership and credibility is critically important. Just as people won't buy electric vehicles unless they feel secure that there's going to be charging infrastructure, businesses are unlikely to sink huge amounts of money in transitioning to renewables and creating the goods and services associated with the clean economy if the politicians are telling them that they're not going to provide an enabling environment in the early years when it's still expensive before you get the learning by doing, before you get the economies of scale. I said already, these things never started cheap. They started expensive, and somebody, usually the taxpayer, had to foot the bill for making them cheap. But in the end, it's in everybody's interest. So unless you get that coordination from government, that the rules of the game, the standards, the regulations, the taxing, the subsidies are going to be favorably disposed to private investment in making this change, the private sector will hold back. Even if they realize this is how the future is going to go, they'll just say, look, we'll wait another 5 years. We'll kick this into touch, and then we'll come back and revisit it in 5, 10 years. Well, that's fine. But if the rest of the world isn't holding back, and, let me give you another example. If 10, 20 years ago, America stood up at these kind of global climate conferences, these sort of annual jamborees, the COPs, and said, we're not going to push climate policies. The Indians and the Chinese said, well, screw you. And they did, perhaps not using those terms, but, they basically said, if you're not going to do it, we're not going to do it. We're much poorer than you. We're not responsible for all this gunk in the atmosphere. You guys are. And if you're not willing to make the change, well, why on earth should we? And the whole thing came to a grinding halt. Now, every time America stands up and says we're going to kind of pull out of the Paris Agreement and we're going to hold back our climate policies, I think the Chinese and the Indians, respond with the proverbial high five. It's great. If America wants to shoot its industry in the foot, that means that, more opportunities for the Chinese and the Indians. You don't see them complaining. You don't see them chivying the Americans, and you certainly don't see them slowing down in their transitions. They see this as an opportunity to steal a march on those countries that act as laggards in terms of recognizing the way the economy is going to evolve, and good on them. Fair play, I say. If they can show strategic leadership and make money out of this, and the planet benefits, then good for them. But I wouldn't recommend that as a policy stance for others to follow.
It's a brilliant case for why organizations must be focused on strategic resilience, because you've just given me a bunch of cases for why. Number one, people will invest in you more if you have looked at that and you are prepared. And number two, you talked about this earlier too. You talked about, Dr. Kelly asked about anxiety, climate anxiety, and you said what really helps me is empowerment and control. Those preparatory plans are what give companies that empowerment and control. I think it's brilliant. All right, Dimitri, are you ready for the very best part of Resiliency the Podcast, the rapid fire questions?
Almost certainly not, no, but go on.
That's perfect. That's how we like them. A little afraid and ready to go.
Yeah,
Dr. Kelly, take it away.
Okay. I'm glad you're not ready, so here we go. What's your favorite movie or TV show that makes you feel resilient?
God. Well, I mean, I have, as I mentioned already, I have an 8-year-old child. So I don't get to read much these days, and most of the movies I've watched are targeted at, a younger market. Although brilliantly, most of these movies, if you're a parent, you'll know this, are really cleverly designed to appeal to both children and the adults, and often with some quite raunchy puns in there that go way over the heads of children. It's sort of dog whistle stuff, but which often result in adults unexpectedly chuckling to children's surprise. But in terms of resilience, I guess a film that I would recommend that I have had the pleasure of watching in the last few years is Wall-E. I don't know if you've seen it. It's an animated.
Yes.
Love that movie.
Yes.
Love that.
And if it's about anything, it's about resilience. It's really about the kind of the worst and the best of human nature, and how we can get ourselves into a hole, and how potentially we can get ourselves out of a hole. And it's a very enjoyable movie to watch.
Oh, that's fabulous. That's fabulous. What about a song that makes you feel resilient?
Oh, God, I thought you might ask me that. Nothing brings it out. The answer I'm going to give is an odd answer, but in terms of giving me a feeling of resilience, the Gorillaz song "Plastic Beach," which actually is all about environmental degradation and pollution and obviously the name's in the title, but the melody is so uplifting that I think it's actually it's actually a tune that kind of champions resilience and inspires people to try and kind of make a better fist of things despite the kind of rather gloomy lyrics.
What's the last thing that made you really laugh out loud?
Oh God, my 8-year-old makes me laugh out loud all the time. You won't want me to begin to explain how and why. Children are nothing if not a sort of both a mix of kind of being absurd, but also pointing out the absurdity of a lot of the adult world. So yeah, I hasten to. I don't really want to kind of go into details as to.
No, you don't need to. You don't need to.
I don't think they bear much kind of bear much scrutiny if made public. But
we're going to protect the 8-year-old, but we can relate to what you just said.
Yes,
totally. So I'd like to ask you, sort of my final question for you is, what is a question you would like to leave for someone in the future coming on to Resiliency the Podcast?
Do you know, right at the beginning, what you said would happen, and I thought of a brilliant question. And then we went on to have this amazing discussion. I have no idea what it was. I was really kind of, I was punching the air inside going, yeah, that's a great question. I've thought of another one. This isn't the punching the air question. This isn't one. So please brace yourself. It's not very good. But I thought, given the festive season that's behind us, how has the next guest sought to build resilience after spending, depending on how they spent the festive season, but if it's anything like the way I spent the festive season, there's going to have to be some work in January to rebuild my personal resilience, and I'd be very keen to get tips to manage. That
That's
could
a
be very helpful.
brilliant question and so well
That's
timed.
good. Yep.
Yes, we will ask
It's
that of the next guest because we want to know too.
That works.
yeah, right. It's back to self-interest, and it's topical. So
It's brilliant, and it's exactly right. We are all reseeking our state of being of resilience. I have a question for you from a past guest, and that question is, Dimitri, what keeps you doing the right thing when no one is watching?
God, who's to say I do the right thing when nobody's watching?
That's right, a daredevil over here.
And that's all I'm going to say on that matter.
That's enough.
Question, please.
Enough said and well answered. Well, Dimitri, listen, you have given us such a wide perspective. I really want to say thank you again for coming on. I am unbelievably impressed with your ability to synthesize your knowledge of climate and resources and governmental geopolitical forces and really dovetail that with a corporate lens and with just a personal resilience lens. I find you just absolutely wonderful. I wonder if you could share, if people who are listening would like to reach out to you, learn more about what you do, follow anything, how can they find you?
So they can find me all over the place. First of all, I've got quite a Googleable name. You'll find that there aren't many Dimitri Zengelises out there. But you can find me at Independent Economics. You can find, which is a bespoke consultancy. You can find me at the London School of Economics. And you can find me at the University of Cambridge as well, where these are the three organizations with which I'm most active. And I have emails associated with each of them, which the alert student will quickly be able to unearth. So, but I'm happy to obviously circulate it with you guys, and if anybody wants to follow up, please do send it to them.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dimitri. We cannot thank you enough. We really appreciate it. And to all of our listeners, thank you so very much for being here. If resiliency is a topic that you, like us, are still working on in your daily life, please subscribe, follow, like this episode, and please keep coming back to hear more stories, strategies, and inspiration on how to embrace change, overcome challenges, and redefine resilience in today's ever-evolving world. As always, I'm Jenn Quader. You can find me online or at my company, thesmartagency.com. My wonderful, brilliant, well-traveled, just incredible co-host, Dr. Kelly Culver. You can find her online, LinkedIn or Instagram, or at theculvergroup.ca. As always, we just wish you the most resilience, the most strength, and we look forward to seeing you on another episode of Resiliency the Podcast. Take care, everybody.